Welcome all my GOAT format players. If you like low production quality ravings about the meta, then you have come to the right place because we are going to talk about a GOAT format tournament whose results I found interesting only because a lot of these top decks were implementing various ideas that I've talked about on this channel. And I just want to be clear here, I'm not trying to take credit for anyone's wins. It's not about like, oh, this person only won because of us. Like, no, it's just more about, I'm like a pundit, right? I predict X will happen. And if X does in fact happen, I like to talk about it a bit further. So first, we got this first place deck here that is playing Time Wizard. Now, this was a card we discussed before in a video. I forget the title of the video, but it was something along the lines of like craziest GOAT format tech cards no one's using or something like that. And number one on that list was Time Wizard. And like when I make videos like that, people tend to like think it's a meme or that I'm trying to like farm views or something. Like, no, if I'm saying this is a good card or this is a good deck, like I'm saying it because I actually believe it and I've tested it, not because like I'm trying to clickbait you all into thinking Time Wizard is good. Like, no, it actually is quite good. And, I talked about that in the prior video, of course, but I'll talk about it again. And it's the fact that in a Chaos deck, it's a light monster that is kind of a, heads I win, tails I don't lose much card. In the sense that, obviously, you call the coin flip right, you get a Raigeki, that's amazing. And if you call it wrong, the Time Wizard dies, and now that's a light in your grave to just summon your Chaos Sorcerer. And then the key thing, of course, is that Time Wizard is a target for Apprentice Magician, which in my prior video, I kind of implied like, hey, you could play the Time Wizard with the Apprentice in the main deck. Here, the Apprentice is in the side. Another interesting part of this deck is the use of Call the Haunted, which also has mild synergy with Time Wizard, in that if you, use Time Wizard, call the coin flip wrong, the Time Wizard's in your grave, you call it back, and then you get a second shot, right? 3 out of 4 chance, essentially. And one thing I've noticed, first of all, I have people, like, in comments of various videos sort of always make the same argument, which is that, oh, ACP, you're saying X is good, but if X was good, everyone would already be using it. It's sort of this idea that the GOAT format meta is 100% rational, right? Nothing is undiscovered. There aren't any cards in GOAT format that are overvalued or undervalued. Like, everything is played in like the correct theoretical proportions. And I mean, I hate to say it, but that's just giving people way too much credit. Even when I played, competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! In advanced format, there were tons of times where cards would be very good and it would take people months to figure it out. And if you were the guy who figured it out before everyone else, you had a big advantage. Now, I don't think you're getting some massive advantage by playing Time Wizard like, oh, if you just start playing Time Wizard, you're going to win every tournament. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that Time Wizard is definitely like a playable card in GOAT format. And when I say playable, I mean playable in competitive tournaments. It will, win you games. And to elaborate on my last point there, one thing that I've noticed, one of the mistakes that, Yu-Gi-Oh! Players make in general, and it might even go beyond Yu-Gi-Oh! Players, probably just even TCG players in general, is that they often have a difficult time evaluating cards that have an element of chance to them. Even something, for example, like Reasoning. Like, obviously, we know Reasoning is a very good card in GOAT format. Same with Monster Gate. But with Reasoning and Monster Gate, there's a bit of a chance component to them. And, Reasoning more so because your opponent can, of course, call the level correctly. And it took many, many years after GOAT format for people to realize that that was even, like, a good card. That 3 Reasoning, 3 Monster Gate was, like, a thing you could play. Took players, I think it was really around the time of 2007. Yeah, early 2007, I think, was the first time that we really saw Reasoning and Monster Gate get played at all. And that, of course, had a chance component to it. Probably even more of a classic example is Snipe Hunter. Like, when Snipe Hunter first came out, no one really talked about it. It was kind of like, oh, here's this garbage common in a set that has mostly garbage commons, because when Snipe Hunter came out, just at that time, there weren't very many good Yu-Gi-Oh cards that would get printed. It's like every set would have like 2 good cards in it, and that was it. So like for the first month or so that Snipe Hunter came out, it was kind of ignored. And then people realized that like, oh, you can use Snipe Hunter to discard Destiny Hero Malicious. And, that's like really good. You can use Snipe Hunter to discard Destiny Hero Disc Commander. That's really good. You can discard Destiny Hero Dasher, like all these cards. And Snipe Hunter ended up becoming not only playable, but it was like one of the best cards in that format, summer 2007. And then I think the format after that, they limited it. And then it kind of like went on the wayside. But for quite a while, like Snipe Hunter dominated Yu-Gi-Oh! And that was something that people didn't expect just because Snipe Hunter had this chance component to it. And of course, if you know me, I'm also going to bring up Cup of Ace, right? As far as I know, I'm the only person to ever top a YCS with 3 Cup of Ace in my deck. And that's another card that, like, I had so many people say, like, oh, I'd love to play your deck, but I would just never play 3 Cup of Ace. Like, even if it was a card that I knew was worse, I would still use it over Cup of Ace. Just because, like, they hate activating a bunch of Cup of Aces, flipping them all wrong, and losing. And the one match of Swiss that I did lose that deck, that was what happened. It's like, oh, I activated, like, 6 Cup of Aces over the course of the match and called one correctly, right? So it's like, people don't sort of like resigning their fate to chance. I mean, maybe this even just goes beyond TCGs and has to do with, sort of the risk-averse nature of people in general, right? Where if you give someone the opportunity to play a game and it's like, hey, we're going to toss a coin. If it's heads, you win $101. If it's tails, you lose $100. Now, that would be plus expected value for that person to play that game, and yet so many people would just refuse to play that game. My wife even says like, oh yeah, gambling is bad. I would never gamble even if like the odds were in my favor. I'm like, well, all right, guess we see that differently. So anyways, I'm not trying to like make this like a whole rant about chance. I'm just pointing out that Time Wizard is a good card, and a lot of people don't even try it. They don't test it because it has that chance component, and they go, oh, even if it's good, I don't want to bother playing it because there's this chance element. Otherwise, not too much to talk about. Only one Upstart Goblin. I've talked before about how, like, yeah, there's a lot of advantages of playing Upstart Goblin in a deck like this, but it's not like a staple. It's, we've seen people in the past couple of years win tournaments with Chaos decks that don't have Upstart Goblin in them, right? Like, it's not something that you're required to do. What's weird, though, is like 1 Upstart, 1 Jargreed. To me, that just feels really strange. Like, why not just figure out which one is better and play 2 of one and 1 of the other? I don't know. The other thing that I get a lot in the comments is like, oh, if this deck took first, and that must mean that like it was a really easy tournament because this deck's bad, and if the tournament was hard, then this deck couldn't have won and something else would have won. Which, like, that's sort of very like self-reinforcing logic. The idea that like, oh, if a tournament meets my expectations, that means that it was like a hard tournament where everyone played well. And if the results of the tournament don't meet my expectations, that means that like, oh, everyone who entered this tournament was like an idiot and it was free or something. But not free at all by any means. There's like 100 players that entered this tournament, and that is a lot. So yeah, moving on. This warrior deck that got second, not too much to talk about. I will say though, the decision of whether you go like sort of the more mid-rangey warrior route or the aggro warrior route, I think that has different implications as far as the meta goes. I'm not really sure like which warrior variant is better. I think that's, to some extent, I think it's like, what do you expect the meta to be? Like, what are your strengths as a player? But notice that like these mid-rangey warrior decks now like aren't playing Kaiku. And if warrior decks aren't playing Kaiku, all of a sudden playing like Call the Haunted in a Chaos deck becomes a more reasonable choice. That's another thing that I think that a lot of like players fail to understand. Like, people, from my discussions with Yu-Gi-Oh players, they always tend to look at things in a very black and white way. Like, this card is good, this card is bad. And it's like, obviously you have certain cards like Pot of Greed that are just the nuts, but like most cards, it's like, if a card is good, it's good for these reasons. If a card is bad, it's bad for these reasons. And if those reasons no longer exist, that suddenly like changes how good the card is. So like if no one's playing Kaiku, playing Call in a Chaos deck becomes a more reasonable choice. That's just, another thing that I want to point out. More importantly, though, more significant is that we had 2 Chaos Return decks in the top 8 of a major tournament. And again, I consider a major tournament to just be any GOAT format tournament with 100 players, or if it's like a stacked invitational tournament like Worlds. So yeah, multiple Chaos Return decks in top 8. I don't know if we've ever seen that before. I think maybe there was like one other tournament a few years ago where we had that. But otherwise, very rare. And that's, again, I'm going to link that video that I made recently talking about like why Chaos Return is such a good pick in this meta. Basically, it's just because the cards match up well against the meta. They match up well against all these Chaos decks. And, this deck, actually, the one that got 4th by Nate Dogg, that is actually the exact deck list that I gave in my last video. So again, like, obviously, he's the one who did the hard work, not me. I think the side was a couple of cards different. Yeah, I think, like, the side is 1 or 2 cards different. But the main deck's the same. And again, that was like another video where I feel like most people didn't really take me seriously, but like if you take just like a couple hours to test this deck against the standard Chaos deck, you'll realize that like the matchup is just very heavily in favor of Chaos Return because all of your cards are so good against their deck, and a lot of the cards that they would traditionally rely on to win games are not very good against your deck. There's some exceptions, like their Dust Shoots are still okay against you, although like you can definitely just go summon Blade Knight, set your whole hand, and play around Dust Shoot. Mind Control, not very good against this deck. Again, I talked about that in my last video, and I won't talk about this deck very much just because, like, again, we did a whole video on it, and that was only a month ago. No reason to really repeat everything. But yeah, you'll see we have like 3 Shining Angels. A lot of people like give me shit for that. They think it's, I don't know, again, like just some sort of joke. And like Shining Angel, it's not a card that you're playing because it's like an amazing card. It's a card that you play because you don't really have better options. And some people might not like that. Some people might say something along the lines of, oh, if I have to play Shining Angel in a Chaos Return deck, that must mean the deck is not very good, and therefore I should play something else. And I'm not saying anyone who plays this deck is going to get amazing results, but like whether or not it has Shining Angel in it, like that has nothing to do with anything. That's just, bias showing, right? Here's the other Chaos Return deck. Pretty similar deck, to be honest, other than the fact that it doesn't play Shining Angels. I will say Ninja Grandmaster is a pretty decent card in this meta if everyone's playing Gravekeeper Spies. So yeah, if you want to go sort of for a route where you like cut Shining Angels for ninjas and add Reinforcement of the Army, I don't think that's terrible too, to be quite honest. So I think this is fine. I don't really like the Magician of Faith. I don't like really know what the 1 Faith is supposed to accomplish. It makes your opponent's mind controls a little better. I also think like you can play the 1 Bazoo over the 2nd Chaos Sorcerer. Again, like I just think that's a bit of a preference. Like it's not like, oh, you have to play Chaos and not Bazoo, or you have to play Bazoo and not Chaos. Like whether you play the Bazoo or the Chaos, it's not gonna make a big difference in terms of results. But yeah, if you just expect everyone and their mother to be playing Spy, like yeah, maybe the Ninja's just better. I mean, it's not gonna be amazing, but it's possible it's better. People, if they don't know you're playing this, they might summon their Chaos Sorcerers in defense, and then you can just run it over with a Ninja, which is pretty good. I do see people doing that. Trap lineup, yeah, I think trap lineup's just exactly the same, actually. Yeah, I feel like this is just, the list that I posted, except it's cutting Angels for these lights, cutting the Sork for Bazoo, that's fine. Notice, though, that in both lists, we have 2 returns. And again, I said this in the previous video, but I'm going to repeat it again. A big part of why Chaos stopped winning in 2023 is the fact that people got this idea that, oh, we should just all start playing 1 return. And like as soon as that happened, like Chaos Return just fell off the map because return, it's not searchable or anything. Like there's no way to guarantee you'll ever draw it if you draw 1. And the people who are playing 1 return, they kind of had the logic of, oh, you don't need return to win. therefore, like, it's fine to play 1. Again, it's like, yeah, you don't need return to win, and that's part of like why this deck is top tier. If the only way the deck could win was by activating return, it wouldn't be a good deck. But at the same time, just because it doesn't need return to win doesn't mean you should only play 1. Like, you could have that logic about any card, like, oh, you don't need Heavy Storm to win, therefore we should cut it, or oh, you don't need Solemn to win, therefore we should only play 2. Like, it's like that logic doesn't really mean anything. Return is one of the best cards in this deck. Now, you don't really want to play 3 just because you don't want to draw multiples most of the time, but it is a card that you want to see almost every game in every single matchup. Even versus some of the decks where return is not necessarily as good, like Goat Control, for example, it's still fine against them. You know, sometimes you just go for like the value return where like your BLS got banished somehow, you return the BLS back, banish one of their monsters, and then just attack them directly with 3 spies or something. And like, it's not game, but you still got really amazing value out of your return. So yeah, I will just say, if you're going to play this deck, play 2 return. Hopefully these results show that, yeah, 2 return is definitely the way to go, as it turns out. As far as the other top 8 decks go, mostly just standard lists, although we have this like Earthbeat deck here. I will say, like, although we haven't really talked about this deck on this channel, Earthbeat has been one of the biggest outperforming decks over the last year or so. Obviously, we know it got second at Worlds. If you watch the replay, Earthbeat could have easily gotten first at Worlds last year. But as far as these lists go, we actually have 2 Earthbeat decks. Yeah, 2 Earthbeat decks in top 16. And when you consider that like almost no one plays Earthbeat, you'll notice it's less than 5% of the meta. That is huge outperformance. These lists are a little weird. Like, playing 2 Zaborg and Earthbeat seems kind of weird. Giant Rat I'm also not like a huge fan of in Earthbeat, but you can definitely play it. You'll notice this other list isn't playing Rat. I'm not gonna lie, like, I think this is, again, like, why aren't more people playing Earthbeat? I think it's like another case of bias. Like, even for myself, I haven't played much Earthbeat just because it feels so weird to say to myself, like, yeah, I'm going to try to win a GOAT format tournament with 3 Goblin Attack Force. Like, that just, I don't know, man. I have some huge mental block that prevents me from playing Goblin Attack Force because it just feels so janky. But it is clearly a real deck. It's gotten good results. You can't really deny that. I think Earthbeat like kind of has a problem with GOAT control. Like, cards like Goblin Attack Force and even cards like Zaborg aren't very good against GOAT control. And, if we look at the side, I haven't looked at the side yet, by the way, but I would hope we have 3 King Tigers in the side. Yeah, we do. Because that is like your only way of beating GOAT control. Like, post-side, you just have to go all in on King Tiger Wango and just hope that it's good enough. Otherwise, you have a bit of a problem with GOAT control. Like, yeah, the nice thing, though, is, like, if you're playing an aggro deck that maybe doesn't do that well against GOAT control, same thing can happen with Warriors, right? Like, if you're playing just a normal Warrior deck, you don't want to play against GOAT control either. But sometimes you can win just because of the fact that, like, if the control deck opens poorly, just kind of draws badly, the beatdown deck can just kind of like cheese them. Like, oh, you had a slow draw, I'm just going to beat you down with a bunch of things. Same thing happens in Magic the Gathering too. It's just sort of a classic aggro versus control matchup where aggro is coming out of the gate strong, and if the control deck stumbles, the aggro deck is going to win even if it's an unfavorable matchup. So even though I think that GOAT control is going to beat this deck more often than not, it's not some ridiculous like 90-10 matchup, right? It's probably like 60-40, right? In favor of GOAT control. And most matchups in GOAT format are 60-40. One of the things that I haven't mentioned in any of my previous videos is that I actually ran the numbers on how often Warrior aggro beat the standard Thunder Dragon Chaos deck. I looked at 13 months of data. So it was last year, 2023, and then the first month of 2024. And in majors, again, a major being a tournament with 100 or more players or an invitation-only tournament, Warriors beat Chaos 62% of the time. And I didn't look at any other matchups only because, like, the sample size was just way too low. Like, there's not much you can conclude. But, like, what's interesting about the numbers is I noticed there were actually no tournaments where Warriors lost to Chaos just in overall matches. There were no majors where that happened. However, even though that was true, Chaos decks won more tournaments than Warrior decks did. And to a lot of people, I think that seems counterintuitive, but again, that's because of like representation. Like I looked at, Nate Dogg's bracket, for example, and, with Chaos Return, and Nate Dogg lost to second and third place. He lost to the second place player in winner's side, and then lost to Jack Sworn in loser's side. And Jack Sworn is playing just like a standard Chaos deck, so it's easy to say like, well, Nate Dogg got eliminated by standard Chaos, therefore should be obvious Chaos Return doesn't beat the standard Chaos deck. But what that ignores is that in order to even get that far, Nate Dogg had to beat a bunch of Chaos players, including Ivan Rosito, who is, one of the best to ever do it. It's, again, I think like people have the tendency to like misinterpret this data, where you can look at Nate Dogg's bracket and go, well, got eliminated by Chaos, therefore Chaos Return clearly not doing that well against standard Chaos. But it's actually quite the opposite. And then when I looked at the Warrior data from the last 13 months, I saw the same phenomenon, where you would have a tournament and the grand finals would be Chaos versus Warriors, and the Chaos deck would beat the Warrior deck. And it's very easy then to conclude, well, in Grand, the Chaos deck beat the Warrior deck, therefore, Chaos beats Warriors. But then you look at the overall matchup data, and actually Warriors was the one beating Chaos. Now, I don't know about this tournament, because again, same thing happened here. Grands, Chaos versus Warriors, Chaos player wins. But, I bet if you look through the bracket that day, Glyclazide probably beat a bunch of Chaos decks and actually ended up with a positive record versus Chaos. So, again, I know I'm going to have a bunch of people in the comments like explaining to me why I'm wrong, why Warriors beating Chaos over, 10 plus tournaments actually means the opposite, that it loses to it somehow. But it really is a case of representation. When you have nearly 3 times as many Chaos decks as Warrior decks, the odds that one of the Warrior decks actually wins the tournament, it is very, very low. Even with, a 62% win rate, which is what I found over the last 13 months. If I, again, have some weighted coin and, heads comes up 62% of the time and tails comes up 38% of the time, and then you go, well, what's the odds of me flipping, several heads in a row, say 3 or 4 heads in a row? It's actually quite low. Even though I'm favored to win each individual coin flip, the odds of me winning the tournament, so to speak, is actually quite low. So kind of an interesting thing to think about. Okay, last deck I want to talk about here. I could talk about others, but I can't really talk about them all. Although this deck is really weird. I won't go on that. But anyways, this deck here by Alefiatu, one of the greatest GOAT players to ever do it, as we all know. And this is interesting because this is a deck that I've talked about like a few times on this channel. I haven't really been pushing it like, oh, this deck's broken, everyone's got to play it. I haven't been saying that. But it is a super slept on deck. Now, I didn't help Alefiatu at all. I didn't give him this deck or tell him to play it, but I have had other players where I did help them with this deck. Johnny Lee being an example of one. He was asking me advice for Worlds, ended up playing this deck. A couple other players as well. And it's a very good deck, and it actually, again, if you test the matchup, which most people don't, it has one of the most lopsided matchups against the standard Chaos deck. But that relies on a few assumptions. Assumption 1, they're not siding Jowgen or Karibo in any significant number. If they're siding one Karibo, who cares? And then assumption 2 is that they don't know what levels to call on reasoning. If both of those assumptions are true, you are going to beat a standard Chaos deck almost every single time. Now, elaborating on the reasoning thing. Part of the reason that I think it is very hard, or harder than you might think otherwise, to win a tournament with a deck like this is because the deeper you go in bracket, you're probably getting feature matches, people are talking about your deck, etc., etc. People are going to know what levels to call on reasoning, right? Because you beat someone, that person tells their friend about your deck, and then they know, oh, I'm actually not supposed to call something like level 4 against this deck, or even level 8 usually. It kind of depends. Like if they just activate a reasoning on turn 1, you probably just want to call level 2. That's like the safest level to call. But yeah, obviously it depends. Like if a Stein's already in the grave and they activate reasoning, well then you don't call level 2 then, obviously. But yeah, this deck is very, very broken, and most of the meta doesn't have a lot of ways to interact with this. However, although I say, this deck absolutely murders chaos, it has difficulties against some other decks in the meta. Like aggro in general tends to be more of a problem for combo decks as a whole. And again, that goes back to what I'm saying that, if you get like a slower draw, the aggro deck has the option to just summon monsters and attack you. And, even against something like Earth aggro, if they hit you with, I don't know, say a Goblin Attack Force, they just get one Goblin Attack Force hit through. Now you're at 57, which means that you can't go like Stein plus Brain Control or Stein plus Premature Burial. If they just deal you another 700 somehow, well, now you can't use Stein at all. And, that is a problem, obviously. And this deck doesn't need Stein to win, but it, of course, is the main way that the deck wins. It has other combos. Sometimes you just go like Fusler plus Metamorphosis into a Labyrinth tank. Yeah, there it is. Labyrinth tank, and then you like limiter it a bunch of times and kill your opponent. Sometimes you just go like Jinzo, Megamorph, limiter, kill your opponent. Like there are other ways to win. You can metamorph your Dark Magician Chaos into a Gatling Dragon, blow up their monsters, limiter game. Definitely like a bunch of ways to win, but the fact that the main win con is Stein means that aggro decks have an easier time against you than most other decks. Goat Control 2 is another one where it's like, if you're good, I'd say you can get a positive win rate against Goat Control, but you just have to ruthlessly play around their scapegoat. The transition side is interesting. When I first profiled this deck, I had a completely different transition side. I'm not really sure what this one is supposed to do. One of the options that like Johnny and I talked about for Worlds was just not having a transition side at all. If you're to just not have a transition side, I think you can go with something like Token Thanksgiving for the scapegoat decks. An option we talked about was like Gravity Bind for the aggro decks. Aggro decks aren't going to side in Mobius against you because you're playing a bunch of Jargreeds and scapegoats. But then having the option to just side in Gravity Bind and stop like Donzalug from hitting you is pretty nice. So, I do think to some extent the meta matters. Like the reason that a deck like this can get top 16 is because of the fact that people aren't siding Kribos, they're not siding Jougans, they're not siding Threatening Roars, they're not siding all these cards that are really good against you. I am excited to see a strong placing from this deck. I also think Metamorphosis is way too good in this deck to not play 3 of. I think Megamorph is way too good to not play 2 of. Although you could also play United We Stand. Like that was one thing that the players and I talked about is instead of the second Megamorph, you could just play United We Stand because Goat's United We Stand is still a thing. I will have a link to that Chaos Return video again because I think it's worth a watch. We talked about Chaos Return in a lot more depth in that video. All the points are really well laid out. I think it really makes a good case for the deck. And I think that is the main thing that outperformed here was Chaos Return. I think both these lists were very good, very well put together. Nate Dogg, I watched some of his replays, and I did see like a couple of mistakes from him. But if anything, I think that showcases how viable the deck is, right? If you're making mistakes and still winning, clearly means the deck's pretty good. So yeah, I think, if, someone like Dingo Sig or a player with that level of skill takes a deck like Chaos Return and, learns how to play it, tests it versus the field, maybe even makes it a little better, maybe refines some of the side deck choices, I think we could really see Chaos Return put up even better results in future tournaments.